Okay, I am going to jump in. We have a packed program today, and I'm really excited about it. Thank you all for joining us. My name, of course, is Ann Mavity, and I'm the Executive Director of Minnesota Housing Partnership. And I'd like to welcome you to our federal and legislative update call. We, of course, MHP works collaboratively with all of you housing stakeholders throughout Minnesota to advance policies and investments to ensure that everyone has access to affordable housing. We will be doing these calls, as we've noted in the past, every other Friday. So looking forward to seeing you again in 2 weeks as well. A reminder to both mute yourself, but also use the chat. We will be, while we have speakers, we'll be monitoring the chat function. And so we will be looking for you to participate as well in some of the questions with our panelists. And we have a great program today. The program today is going to start a little differently. I'm going to spend a couple minutes at the beginning doing a quick overview of some of the facts and figures of housing, just to ground our conversations today in, again, those facts and figures. And then our panelists will include the respective House and Senate vice chairs of the Housing, Finance, and Policy Committees, Senator Zach Duckworth on the Senate side, and Representative Mike Howard on the House side, and I'll be introducing them in a minute. We'll have some brief federal updates, and then also have a focus a little bit at the end on energy and housing and energy burden as an impact on that. It includes Ben Passer from Fresh Energy and Metric Giles from the Community Stabilization Project. So I'm going to jump right in to a program to talk again a little bit about the facts and figures of housing. So I want to talk about why is housing so unaffordable. You know, we talk a lot, and many of you have seen this before, that the basic reason that housing is unaffordable is that wages are not keeping pace with housing costs. Almost all the top in-demand jobs in Minnesota don't pay enough to pay the basic amount you need to afford a 2-bedroom apartment. And of course, Minnesota's housing crisis is hitting hardest for workers who are low-wage workers in jobs that have the highest projected growth. So things like home health care aides, the folks taking care of my mom, or watching your kids, or delivering food to our homes. Most of those jobs don't pay enough to pay the rent. Now, we also know that rent burden is felt around the state. This is not a metro issue. It's not localized in any way. Almost every single one of our 87 counties has rent burden. And in fact, more than 25% of all renter households are paying more than they can afford for their housing. And we know that this is actually experienced worse by households of color, that they're experiencing that more. And what that means is that folks are paying more than 30% of their income for housing, and it leaves them with very little income to pay for other necessary costs like food and transportation. So, and this is the more than 25%. We can go to the next slide. Now, we can't talk about affordable housing ever without fully understanding the role that race has played in our housing outcomes. Centuries, decades of methodical and intentional racist housing policies have resulted in unequal housing opportunities and housing outcomes that we're seeing today. So, for example, if you are a homeowner, if you are a person of color, you're half as likely to be a homeowner. If you're a person of color, you're 2.5 times more likely to be severely cost burdened, which means paying more than you can afford for rent. And if you're a person of color, you're 6 times more likely to experience homelessness. So we know that we have to have the same strategy and method and intention in which all these policies over a century have been put in place. We need to use that same intention to remove those. And I know that at least on the House side, there's a committee that's been looking at that and has a number of recommendations that I think are very useful as a reference point on that. So let's talk a little bit about rental assistance because, traditionally the federal government has helped get the rents paid for low-income folks through this housing choice voucher program. And it helps bridge that gap that we just talked about between the wages that aren't keeping up and the cost of housing. But the problem is that even while our population has been growing over years, the actual number of rental vouchers available to Minnesotans has not only not been growing, but has been reduced. And that has left us with the fact that 3 out of 4 households that are eligible for rental assistance do not receive it. And that's in contrast to the fact that all homeowners who are eligible for the home mortgage interest deduction have always received it. So there's no cap for the higher income homeowners to receive their federal subsidies, but there is on the rental assistance. And again, what that means is that the low-income households that don't get a rental assistance voucher are paying way too much for their housing. So let's also talk about the production of new housing, because certainly investing in housing bonds and other production tools are absolutely essential. The data here was taken from the Governor's Housing Task Force 2 years ago, and it helps explain why there's this mismatch between the supply and demand for housing. So first, what this shows is, I think it's 2017 data, and what it shows is that of about 8,800 units that were produced that year, of the lowest income, on the left-hand side, you see the lowest income households, 30% AMI and below, and on the right are units produced for the highest income households, which are like 80% of income or higher. And the light blue bar indicates how many units should be produced to accommodate year-over-year population growth. So what you're seeing here is that what's needed based on renter incomes in this lower bar is about 25% by income of all the units produced. But what actually happens is that the vast majority of production is for this 80% income earner and above. And if you look very far on the left-hand side of that top bar, you see a very thin light green line, and that represents a couple hundred units a year that are produced for these hard-working folks that are making 30% area income and below, which means about $30,000 or less. And that has happened year over year over year over year. And what that means is that we are so far behind in production, and the market is just not producing for the lowest income folks. So that is another reason why our low-income households are so cost burdened as well, because they have to access those higher income units that they can't afford. Now, the last thing I'll just point out then is on a supply problem. So this has happened year over year over year, and way back in 2006, when the recession started, what happened was that production plummeted dramatically, and we fell so far behind to what that straight green line across is showing, which is the need. And we fell so far behind that we now have to sort of overproduce in order to keep up. And that will not rebalance. The whole period is about 20 years. So what we need now is to catch up to this lack of production. And again, it shows why this supply and demand isn't working. So the last point I'll make is on NOAH housing, is that not only do we need to produce, we need to preserve the housing we have. Because in fact, this naturally occurring affordable housing is actually produced in the private sector, and it's the largest source of affordable housing we have in Minnesota and in the nation. But the problem is we're losing more than we are producing every year through sales, through rent increases, through stagnating wages. In fact, we lose about 6,500 units a year versus producing about 5,300 units a year. So this mismatch just isn't working. So as we look at all of this, the production, the preservation, the mismatch in the supply and demand, these are some of the reasons that we're having these affordable housing challenges. So with that, as setting the stage for what our challenges are facing our state, and we can turn the PowerPoint off. What I'd like to do now is introduce our speakers for the day. We have joining us today Senator Zach Duckworth. He's a freshman Republican from Lakeville, and in addition to serving as Vice Chair of the Housing Finance and Policy Committee and as Vice Majority Leader, he also serves on the Education, Finance, and Policy Committee, Local Government Committee, and the Veterans and Military Affairs Committee. And his background includes being a real estate agent and serving as the chair of the Lakeville School Board, as well as service in the National Guard, and thank you for your service. We also have with us today Representative Mike Howard. He is a Democrat from Richfield. He was first elected in 2018 to the House. And in addition to serving as Vice Chair of the Housing, Finance, and Policy Committee, Representative Howard also sits on the Higher Ed Committee and the Preventing Homelessness Division and the Tax Committee. Previously, Representative Howard served as a city council member in Richfield and as a communication director for the Minnesota House DFL caucus, among other things. So to both of you, welcome. Are you on the line here?
I hope so.
Yeah, gotcha. Great. Welcome.
Happy to be here. Yeah.
Thank you. So thank you both for coming. I thought we would just start by saying, housing has risen in the headlines over the past year, like no other time. And I wonder if each of you can begin by just talking about how you and your respective caucuses are approaching these housing issues and the competing issues during this session broadly. Why don't we start with you, Representative Howard?
Thank you, Ann, and thanks for kind of the good grounding in really the state of play, what we're up against, so to speak. And I really think this last year we've all been through has shown so clearly how vital home security is, housing security is to our health, our wellness, our economic security. And it is, folks are challenged like never before. And that's sort of the tough news, but I would say that the good news is there is a larger interest and focus on these challenges like never before. It seems like each year over the last several years, more folks have sort of got it, so to speak. And there's more, amidst so many competing priorities, there's a larger focus. And one thing that struck me, I was on a call with a lot of my colleagues, and the speaker mentioned that of the first term members that were just newly elected, the number one committee that they talked about wanting to serve on was housing. And, I'm quite certain that that's never been the case before. And it just speaks to the challenges that Minnesotans are facing all across the state. And that's what representatives are hearing from their constituents. They're hearing folks say that I need to be able to afford my home. It's sort of that hierarchy of needs start with housing. I always say, whether we're talking about economic disparities or racial disparities, our opportunity gap, all roads lead back to home. And so I'm glad to see that there's more of a recognition that if we want to address so many of the issues we face, housing should be front and center.
Thank you. Senator Duckworth?
Well, thank you and good morning to everybody. I appreciate the invitation to be here. And I would just say that I think Representative Howard nailed it. I'm a new guy, so I can only bring so much to the table and so much insight to the conversation this morning, but I'm happy to share thoughts with you. And what I can tell you is, at least in the Senate, this is the first time we have a committee dedicated to housing. And that should hopefully illustrate to the folks of Minnesota just how big of a priority we deem it to be. The fact that now for its own first time has a standalone committee so it can be given the attention that it deserves, I think is pretty telling in terms of just how big of a priority we see housing for the state, as Representative Howard mentioned. And that's both sides of the aisle, right? So I guess I would leave you with that. In terms of just how critical we think it is. We're having constant conversations about how we can improve upon home ownership and help those that are in need. In its essence, when we talk housing, or in a large part, we're talking about the American dream. right? Everything that we grew up learning about or folks know about our state and our country and their ability to prosper and do well by them and their families. So it's an important topic, and I'm glad that we're having the discussion today. So thank you very much.
Great. So we recently heard that the state surplus went from a $1.2 billion deficit to a projected $1.6 billion surplus. How does that change the equation and your thinking and your caucus's perspective on how investments can be deployed, and how does housing fit into it with so many urgent and pressing needs? And maybe Senator Duckworth, we'll start with you.
Sure, great question. And I don't think, I think we can all agree that the fact that we swung from what was projected to be such a significant deficit to surplus is a very positive thing, right? We're thrilled and happy to see that. As you mentioned, I'm also on the education committee, and I am a former school board member. So when we're looking across the state in terms of resources and how we're going to divert some of these funds or how we can use them, obviously we have competing interests. Education is just one example. That plus we have to factor in how much federal assistance we might be getting and where we can utilize those funds as well for certain programs. So what I can tell you is we're in the early stages of looking at this new information, looking at the surplus, and trying to decide where does it make the most sense to try to utilize some of this money in a way that can be most impactful for folks. Obviously, one of our most critical needs is housing. That's why there's an eviction moratorium that's currently in place to try to help with that, both folks that are renting as well as the owners of those properties. I think we have to assess and analyze that situation and figure out what's the path moving forward, especially as we hopefully continue to see some improvement in our numbers as it relates to the pandemic. So the good news is it maybe changes our discussion in terms of where or how significant we're looking for reductions, and we can focus on where we have the funds to utilize or they're most critically needed right now.
And before I go to Representative Howard, maybe I'll add to this question too, because we understand that housing targets are being discussed with each caucus. I've understood on the Senate side that at least $100 million was requested. Again, do you have any update on sort of where you think these budget targets might land? Senator Duckworth, just to finish that up, and then both questions to Representative Howard.
Sure, I'll be very transparent with you. This week we had a discussion about targets, and the discussion was we're in the early stages. We're still trying to figure out what our targets are going to be and where we want them to be. So that's the very honest answer for you. Is this being recorded? Because the answer is I don't know. So that might come back to haunt me.
That's right. Okay, thank you. Representative Howard, same question to you about the surplus, and then, and the targets.
It's a great question, and as Senator Duckworth mentioned, obviously it's good news. It doesn't really change the fact that we've got really challenging decisions to make. And I guess from my perspective, our focus while we had a deficit was our first priority should be to direct our attention and resources and investment on the Minnesotans and small businesses that have been most impacted by this pandemic. Because we know that the outcomes and recovery has been K-shaped, where folks that have those at the very top and very large corporate businesses have been doing quite well, while we know so many Minnesotans are out of work, especially lower wage workers, especially workers that are struggling to afford their rent, are renters and homeowners as well. And so in some ways the priorities remain the same. But with a better budget forecast news and a potential assistance from the federal government, hopefully it allows us to make a bigger dent. And in terms of the budget targets, we're in a similar place as the Senate. That once we had the forecast announced last week, that sort of really sets in motion the rest of the session. And so our housing committee met this week to have some initial discussions. And I'll be transparent, I'm talking to my colleagues, and I hope we can have a very large target in housing, a target that's larger than the governor. Of course, the governor put out a housing budget before we had news about the surplus. But one thing as it relates to targets that I've been thinking about with my second go here is it's really important for us to not just think about it in sort of this area of the budget gets a X% increase. In particular in housing, that can be just be a recipe for the status quo, because as folks might know, of our state budget, 0.3% of our state budget is the Minnesota housing finance budget. And so if we do a 10% increase, we're just kind of on the margins, maybe upping up some investments of the programs that we already fund. And when you go to the presentation that you gave, Ann, to me, it's clear that just sort of incremental changes in how we fund and think about this housing problem isn't going to help us address the huge need. So I'm hoping that we can kind of think outside the box when it comes to how we support and invest in housing this session.
Well, let me follow that, and I'll start with Senator Duckworth. Let me follow that with, even within, we have housing competing with other issues for funding, but even within housing, to your point about some of the traditional spending that we've done, there's also competing interests within housing. There are so many excellent strategies across the housing continuum. We have in the chat someone talking about mobile home manufactured housing communities and how they're a great source of lower rents and home ownership opportunities as well. We've talked about NOAA and how preservation of housing is critical, and there haven't really previously been strategies for NOAA. And this year with $50 million as a proposal for direct appropriations, as well as adding it to HIVs. So maybe Senator Duckworth, starting with you, how do you sort of prioritize single family needs, manufactured housing, production, preservation? Where do you see some of this shaking out? And then the same question to you, Representative Howard, as well.
So thank you for that great question, and to the folks that are commenting about manufactured home communities. I think if you have a chance, or if you haven't already, if you look at some of the committee discussions we've had in the Senate, we actually, manufactured home communities have come up quite a bit. We actually just had a committee meeting yesterday focused on how do we make it easier for folks to rehab some of those properties if need be. How do we increase rehab loan caps for manufactured homes, et cetera, because we understand that as far as affordable housing, they are some of our best chances at helping to impact what we're experiencing. I've got 4 manufactured home communities in or around my district alone, so that's a great question. And we're going to keep working on that. We haven't lost sight of it. You mentioned differing interests even within housing, and I think that's true. And I think also too, sometimes you have just differing philosophies on how we can best impact what we're experiencing in housing. And you'll hear myself and the chair of the Housing Committee in the Senate speak a lot about home ownership and how do we help people become owners of property for them and their families to build generational wealth. And some of this gets back to what you talked about earlier about some of the things that different races have experienced over the course of our history in housing. And the more we can prop up home ownership for everybody, the better it's going to impact them and their families for generations to come. But that's only part of the issue we're discussing today, because we also have the rental component. And how we impact and provide things like rental assistance or help keep rents more affordable is something that we're constantly working on as well. But it gets back to the issue of supply and demand. I'm in the real estate industry, so what I do every single day, when I'm not doing this, of course, and combating the supply and demand issue, or allowing us to increase or create more units is really one of the fastest ways, other than subsidies, that we can help keep rent affordable. And that's what you're going to see us continue to try to focus on, is how can we support and prop up the creation of more units or just the expansion of inventory, because with more supply, sometimes that can help us curb or keep that price more affordable for folks.
Thank you. Representative Howard?
Thank you. It's a really good question, in part because, and it's tough to answer because the reality is it's yes and when it comes to housing. We need all across the housing continuum. Yes, we need to be investing in manufactured home, park, and preservation. Yes, we absolutely need to be taking home preservation, naturally occurring affordable housing seriously. And as you mentioned, that's an area where the state really hasn't had a role, and we absolutely must. And yes, we need to be trying to make sure that the dream of home ownership is a reality for everyone. And as I think we've discussed, we have some of the largest disparities in terms of who can access. And so what I've seen in just my short time is, because the needs are so great in housing, sometimes there can be amongst ourselves in the housing world, we can get into sort of these competitions. But what I would call out for us, and just back to the budget target conversation, I think together as housing advocates, it's important to be advocating for the outside the box thinking, the outside the box investment, because the reality is these in the housing realm, if we're truly going to meet Minnesota's long-term housing needs, it's yes, and we need to be making all of these investments.
So I have two other big issues. We have about 3 or 4 minutes left. So I have two other big issues I want to ask you about. So talking about production, bonds for housing are always used as an effective tool for increasing production. This year, with housing infrastructure bonds as well as GO bonds, and the governor's proposed a bonding bill, how are you seeing this as a tool both for economic stimulus, job creation, as well as to accelerate production? And noting that advocates led by MHP as well, we are asking for $400 million in housing infrastructure bonds and $100 million in GO bonds to make sure, again, to take advantage of these crazy low interest rates and everything else. So Senator Duckworth, how are you seeing this whole bonding issue and the dynamic, especially Senator Bach now caucusing independently? How do you see the dynamic of this playing out?
Well, I'm going to give you probably a very unsatisfying answer, which is I just don't know at this point in time. What I can tell you is, we recognize that it's a significant issue. We want to help expedite and increase inventory as quickly as possible, especially affordable inventory. But the caveat to that is we still want it to be done to standard, with quality and safely. But what I can tell you is, we really want to, let loose the ability of, whether it's private or government or whatever, the ability to create more inventory, because that's what we need. The graph that you showed earlier about the decline in housing, but the continued growth of population is something I've been teaching about for years in the real estate profession. We stopped building homes for about a decade, but our population continued to grow. So not only, do we have to play massive catch up. And that's going to take a partnership, a coalition, a combination of private and government agencies and entities coming together to say, hey, how can we, using common sense, increase inventory? Like you mentioned beforehand, not just for those at the highest of the income levels, right? But for those that span the spectrum of income, because it's that first-time home buyer, that person that's trying to rent, someone that's just trying to become a homeowner for the first time, as an example. They're really struggling. There's a lack of affordable housing at those income levels. We're aware of it, and we're going to continue to try to use the tools at our disposal to affect it.
And as I toss this to you, Representative Howard, as we talk about housing infrastructure bonds and adding new eligible uses to preserve housing, which we know is extraordinarily cost effective to preserve the housing that we already have through this NOAA strategies. Same question to you on bonding. What's the dynamic here? What can we expect? What do you see?
Thanks for the question. I mean, I think we should, as Senator Duckworth said, let's let loose. Let's make a big investment in terms of, I don't know if that's exactly the context he meant, but we really need to go big. And this is the right time with where the economy is at. We still have low interest rates. And when you look at the long-term challenges, it is really all upside for us to be making significant investments in housing infrastructure bonds. And that tool allows us to leverage both public and private resources to build and hopefully preserve housing as well. You mentioned and then sort of new use discussion. So I really believe that we should be looking to that tool of housing infrastructure bonds to do things like preserve our naturally occurring affordable housing. It's going to be always more cost effective for us to preserve what we have than build new. We should be doing both, but if we're going to take steps to expand uses, we also have to expand the pie, grow the resources we're utilizing. Because right now, I'm forgetting the exact numbers, but Commissioner Ho talks about this last year, we spent about 100 million in housing infrastructure bonds. And that still meant that 2 out of the 3 projects that sort of came asking for resources had to be denied. The need is that great. And so I'm hopeful that we can work together on a bipartisan basis to have a bonding bill this year and for housing infrastructure bonds to be a big piece of it.
Thank you for that. We're really out of time. I wonder if we can do a 30-second lightning round on a topic that could be its own half-hour discussion, which is the eviction off-ramp, right? That we know that the eviction moratorium has served as this essential public health tool during this pandemic, both in Minnesota and around the country. Now, with vaccinations ramping up, and we're looking, towards normality. What do you see as the essential tools? We know that there's, as you see in the chat and otherwise, there's lots of proposals to ensure that tenants are protected, that landlords get their rents paid as small business owners. What do you see as the essential tools to an effective off-ramp? And why don't I start with you, Representative Howard, and then we'll sign off, sort of a lightning round, and then Senator Duckworth as well.
Yes, it's a big question, maybe as it relates to the pandemic, the biggest one before the legislature and the administration. I do think that as I've talked to kind of stakeholders on all sides, there's some parameters that there's buy-in on terms of kind of what we want. We want a orderly conclusion to the eviction moratorium that both make sure that landlords are made whole and that prevents a wave of evictions. And so to me, the key recipe or the key elements, one, we need to make sure that the rental assistance that the federal government prescribed in the latest CARES Act is up and running, and that we can help renters get to current. And we know that based on national data, billions of dollars of rent is due. And then
Right.
the other piece is, I do think that some sort of understanding of the timing would be helpful for landlords to prepare. Mindful, it's tough, as we've seen, that kind of planning is tough amidst a pandemic that we can't necessarily control. And then the last element, I do think we absolutely need, when we talk about an off-ramp, some sort of cooling off period or notice period, not a hard and fast end to the eviction moratorium in a wave of eviction filings. Some sort of notice period will allow tenant advocates and others to close the gap and make sure that, again, both renters and landlords are made whole, and that we prevent a wave of evictions.
Thank you. And Senator Duckworth, I apologize because I think you probably had to go right at 9:30, but I want to give you the last word on this.
I appreciate it. I just told folks I'm running a little bit late, so thank
you.
Well, first off, I want to mention homelessness, because I don't want to come and talk about housing and not mention homelessness. So it's an important issue. Obviously, Representative Howard would agree. We're trying to positively impact it as best we can. It carries over to some of my work in the Veterans Committee as well, but I just want to let folks know that that's an important issue that we are trying to make a priority as well. As far as the off-ramp goes, first off, it needs to have, the plan for it needs to have bipartisan support. I think that's going to be the best thing that makes it successful. To that end, in the Senate, we're trying to form a working group of Republicans and Democrats to say what makes the best sense for the off-ramp plan. And there needs to be a plan for it. And it needs to start getting communicated early and often so people know what to do. We have renters that are struggling right now in terms of having the funds they need to make rent, but then we've also got the homeowners that are having significant issues right now in terms of being able to pay their mortgages. That's a big deal. We don't want them to lose those properties, because then all of a sudden we're going to be back to what we experienced in 2008 if we have a lot of foreclosures, et cetera. Nobody wants that. We definitely don't want that. And I think a lot of times people view these landlords as these big companies that own hundreds of units, and maybe they're only not collecting on 20 or 30% of their units, when sometimes we're talking about our neighbors who might own one rental property and they're not collecting on 100% of it. And that's their plan for their kids' college, was to sell that property or use the rent that they're getting from it. So to your point, and to Representative Howard's point, it's a significant issue. It needs to be a planned, steady off-ramp. It's happening all across the country in other states if they aren't already back to business as usual. So it's time for us to sit down, put together a good bipartisan off-ramp plan that allows us to do it sooner rather than later and keeps both the tenant and the property owner in mind. Thank you so much for your time this morning.
Yeah, I was going to say thank you. I know you have to run. Thank you to both of you. The fabulous conversation. So much more to come. We appreciate your time. With that, and I apologize, I'm running a little behind schedule to everyone, but I'm going to turn this right over to our Deputy Executive Director and Policy Director, Elizabeth Glidden, to provide some federal update.
Thank you. I'm actually going to really shortcut this so that we can get to our two remaining guest speakers, and we will send out a more detailed federal update as we have been doing on our email list. But I'll maybe just say two headlines on what's happening federally. First, some good news from one of our Minnesota members of Congress. We have just received exciting news that Senator Smith has now been chosen to be the new chair of the Housing, Transportation, and Community Development Subcommittee on the Senate Banking Committee. So lots of opportunity there. We are hearing that she is very excited about this role and turning that into a very active subcommittee. Second headline is that the American Rescue Act plan, or the American Rescue Plan Act, excuse me, is moving forward quite speedily in Congress. The Senate should start voting on amendments today, and we know that there's a lot of pressure to have this wrapped up and passed by the deadline for unemployment insurance benefits, which are expiring March 14th. So American Rescue Act does today include $40 billion in critical housing assistance fund, including additional emergency rental assistance, $10 billion in homeownership assistance, and some additional utility assistance and assistance directed to assisting those who are experiencing or in jeopardy of homelessness. So with that, I'm going to move us forward to our two remaining guest speakers. And our next is Ben Passer, and followed by Metric Giles. These are two of my colleagues that I am really pleased to bring on this program because they both have a focus on the intersection of energy and housing, and also communicating about the energy burden that is experienced and needs to be addressed on behalf of renters. So with that, I'm turning it over to Ben from Fresh Energy, where he is the lead director of the Energy Access and Equity Division. Ben, are you here?
I'm here, Elizabeth. Can you hear me all right?
Perfect. And I know
Great.
we have slides for you. There they are.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Elizabeth, and good morning, everyone. I'm Ben Passer. I'm the lead director of Energy Access and Equity at Fresh Energy, and I'll be talking about our work to center equity in energy and housing. So on the next slide, just to have a little bit of background on Fresh Energy. We're an independent energy policy nonprofit. We're based in St. Paul, and for about 28 years now, we've been working at the state legislature, the Public Utilities Commission, and with state agencies and local governments to advance clean energy in Minnesota. So in my time, I'd like to start by level setting with a definition of equity, just so we're all on the same page. Talk a little bit about our work with partners and why it matters, and then finally discuss how we've taken steps to advance equity and energy efficiency programs with a focus on rental housing and under-resourced communities. So on the next slide, just to level set, when I talk about equity in my work, I refer to it as having two main components. We've defined equity as having, or as being the elimination of barriers to full participation in the process and access to the full benefits of the outcome. So this is an intentionally broad definition, and it's designed to reflect the unique needs of any given individual, group, or community, and acknowledge that fully realizing this definition of equity in practice will inherently require different levels of investment, such as time, outreach and education, or financial support for certain groups, especially those who have been historically under-resourced or marginalized. So in sum, the main takeaway here is that the emphasis is on both the process and the outcome. On the next slide, we'll talk a little bit more about process and outcome throughout the presentation, but really wanted to emphasize that renters in particular, as we heard through the previous conversations, face a unique set of barriers. So along with Minnesota Housing Partnership, Community Stabilization Project, and others, Fresh Energy is proud to be one of the co-leads of the Minnesota Multifamily Affordable Housing Energy Network. That's a long name and a mouthful to say, so we lovingly abbreviate our network to MMAHEN. So since 2014, this network has connected the energy and housing sectors in Minnesota to break down silos in communication, address challenges, and identify solutions. Our network includes a diverse range of interests and perspectives, including utilities from across the state, energy and housing advocates, housing owners and developers, service providers, and renters and renter advocates. So through this network, we've been able to find numerous opportunities to expand access to energy efficiency for under-resourced Minnesotans and support stable and affordable housing in our state. On the next slide, you can see really that this network was built with intentional focus on serving multifamily buildings and under-resourced households because energy efficiency in multifamily buildings and other residential properties is a win-win. Increased energy efficiency is one of the lowest hanging fruits to tackle high energy burdens, which, as I'll talk about in a minute, is a significant problem throughout the state. As Anne noted in her opening presentation, a large portion of all renters are cost burdened, making high energy bills even harder to afford. Further, a recent study of rental households in the Twin Cities found that under-resourced households had roughly double the energy burden of the average household. Energy efficiency also contributes to increased health and comfort, reducing potential medical expenses or costly tenant turnover. And through the long-term savings provided by energy efficiency, utility customers, whether the renter or building owner pays the bill, can not only see direct savings on utility bills, but building owners benefit from lower maintenance costs over the life of the building. Going to the next slide, to expand on the issue of energy burden, this map comes from the U.S. Department of Energy's Low-Income Energy Affordability Data, or LEAD tool, and shows that high energy burdens, the darker areas on the map, are a significant problem in every part of the state. This probably looks similar to Anne's presentation on rent burden, showing a similar map on the rent side. Digging even deeper, we know that some Minnesotan households are facing even higher energy burdens. The most recent Home Energy Affordability Gap report, conducted by researcher Roger Colton and his team, found that households below 50% of the federal poverty level, I believe that's roughly $13,000 for a family of 4, are paying 33% of their income for energy costs alone. That's striking when you consider that 33% refers solely to energy costs and doesn't factor in other basic necessities such as housing, food, and healthcare. Going to the next slide, one successful example of our work to expand access in utility programs has been our efforts supporting the development of Excel and CenterPoint's multifamily building efficiency program. A little over 6 years ago, Excel and CenterPoint began developing a jointly delivered one-stop shop energy efficiency program to facilitate easier access for multifamily buildings. Our network, MMAHEN, provided feedback to the utilities as the program developed, identifying possible pain points for building owners and working to align program requirements with key funding timelines from the state's Housing Finance Agency. The first several years of the program were successful, but CSP and some of our other partners identified that there was an unmet demand for renters to directly access these benefits, especially in buildings where building owners were not interested or were unable to participate. In 2018, our MMAHEN network co-hosted visioning sessions with Excel and CenterPoint, bringing renters and utilities to the same table to discuss potential solutions. These conversations continued through the following year, and in 2020, Excel and CenterPoint for the first time introduced renters kits, a package of energy efficiency measures that renters can receive without the need for prior permission from their building owner. Without direct input and participation from impacted individuals, this barrier may not have been adequately addressed. And this new renters kit component has the added benefit of potentially engaging building owners to participate through conversations with their renters who have received the kits. Most recently, in the most recent planning cycle that concluded last fall, all of Minnesota's major investor-owned utilities proposed increased or expanded programs serving under-resourced households. However, we know that significant potential remains in this segment. The Energy Conservation and Optimization, or ECO Act, which has been introduced in the House as House File 164 and as a Senate companion, Senate File 227, would go a long way toward ensuring that energy efficiency programs better meet the need, including increasing the minimum amount utilities are required to spend on programs serving under-resourced customers. On the next slide, you can see that we're also looking at other solutions to encourage deeper investments in energy efficiency for under-resourced households. One approach that we've proposed is in addition to Minnesota's current financial incentive mechanism, which rewards utilities for achieving deeper savings in their energy efficiency programs. Our proposal would specifically focus on programs serving under-resourced households and essentially reward utilities for delivering deeper savings to customers through major measures and going above and beyond the minimum requirement in Minnesota statute. This concept received initial support from the Public Utilities Commission last fall, and we're currently in the process of refining it for approval later this year. And to close with my last slide, the second part of our equity definition that I shared earlier focuses on process. Equity requires an inclusive and participatory process. For all of the reasons discussed earlier, all of the disproportionate impacts and inequities, it is critical for community members and impacted individuals to not just have a seat at the table or a place in the room, but to have a voice in the process. We're continually looking at ways to improve the processes that we participate in and those that we convene to make sure that these solutions work for everyone. That's all from me. I just wanted to again thank MHP for the invitation and thank you all for your time this morning.
Thank you so much, Ben. I think due to time, we're probably going to switch to our next speaker to make sure we have enough time to hear from him. But I just want to say that partnering with Fresh Energy has been really helpful to MHP in informing our work on housing and ensuring that we're really thinking more comprehensively of all of these influences and pressures and how energy is a part of that. And we really have been expanding our work to think about the PUC in partnerships with utility companies and others in thinking about what are those pressure points we need to apply to ensure that under-resourced households are getting a better representative participation in the benefits that are out there around energy efficiency. So with that, I'm going to turn to our last speaker, Giles, who is a director with the Community Stabilization Project. Ben just mentioned Community Stabilization Project as a key leader in the MMAHEN network. And with that, I will say that I'm hoping that we can first learn a little bit about what the work Community Stabilization Project has been focused on most recently. MHP has been growing our relationship with the Community Stabilization Project, and I can say that Metric and CSP have been a key influence on the MMAHEN network's policies and priorities, including what is the narrative around under-resourced households. Metric, are you there?
Metric, I believe you're still muted.
Hello.
There.
Hello, everyone. There we go. Thank you.
Perfect.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and everyone out there on the call. So Metric Giles with the Community Stabilization Project. Tagline is renter stability will lead to community stability. So I want to do a little dispelling of the American dream that homeownership is like the pedestal that we want to reach for. What we really want to do, what we do at CSB, is we provide hope and we bring that hope into a reality. And through that reality is that we're providing opportunities for people to be stable from where they are. In Minnesota, 80% plus of homeownership is Europeans. For African Americans, 93% of African Americans are renters, meaning that 7% of home ownership for African Americans. So if we're really reaching that American dream in America, we're really doing a very poor job of that. And I think it's because of the process that we're leaving that is what we want to be at. We want to start with where people are. So what we're trying to do is stabilize people, and we do that through the relationship of renters and property owners. And one of the pieces that we are really trying to move forward is the language that we use. The language of tenants and landlords, that has been an oppressive, depressive relationship and experience in America. So it's like, what we're saying is property dwellers, which are the renters, and the property owners, the key piece of that is the education, them having an understanding each of their rights and responsibilities. And through that understanding, it forges a deeper long-term stability in relationship. So the other piece that goes along with the work we do, we actively engage property owners to where we actually lease the properties out, because to overcome the barriers that they face themselves in trying to rent to people who have barriers of history, credit rating, or even other type criminal histories. And so we step in and we take that position and we lease out to them. We make sure that their rent is there. And while we're doing that, we're helping to educate, stabilize the people, help find jobs, reach out to our network of resources, wherever it is. We don't try to be the one source to do it all, but one of the key pieces that we do is networking and collaboration. So today I have heard some very good comments. I want to do a little clarifying of those comments I have heard today. One of the words is investment, and that is very important. I have heard that word repeatedly, but in the systems that we have a kind of like a split level of, when we're working with Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and people who are economically marginalized, what we do is we subsidize them. And with that subsidizing, we do not have an actual expectation of a return. We do say we are sustaining those people. If we're sustaining those people, then, and everyone else is moving forward, then actually being sustained is actually moving people back. But then we have this other side where we're actually saying we're subsidizing them, but we don't even call it subsidizing. We call it investments. And when we invest in people, we're actually, it's a regenerative. We expect a return, we want a return. And so in this case, I heard creativity as well. So, and if we're going to do that, we have to change the processes. We cannot continue to have a process that actually says, in order to get help, you have to qualify to be subsidized to get assistance. There was a figure of 33%. So we're really not really touching through that application of subsidizing people. We're not reaching the major part of the population and the major part of Minnesota. Because when we talk about racial equity, when we talk about energy efficiency, those are one and the same. That if the people who are the renters, like right now we're finding out, we have to really make sure that we stabilize the renters. If we did not stabilize the renters like everyone in the whole country is doing, there's a realization our system, we will go into a major foreclosure crisis right now. So Elizabeth, I don't really know if exactly how you want me to continue, but the piece that I do want to just say with the energy efficiency, that being a major tool, that if we're going to change these things, racism, if we talk about racial equity, we have to also have justice. And justice means that we have policies that will provide opportunities for everyone. I came up with this thing that it's called Practical Intersectional Energy Efficiency Application and Opportunities. So that's the initiatives that I would really like for us to start. Like, bring the opportunities and issues of dealing with energy efficiency down to the groundwork level, that it just doesn't stay at the high level of solar system at like multifamily or for the people who have the money, how do we bring it back down in our community? I'm going to use one big example that I saw yesterday. I saw a guy riding his bike. When I talk about intersectionality, it was dusk, and he had his bike and a trailer. And he was going down the bike. Can we start, if we want people to start using these bike lanes, can we start making opportunities for people to have solar systems, lights and protection on their helmets and on their bikes? That's a community level. Can we, the people who survived in Texas had generators. Can we provide generators that people, that is solar energy efficient type? So Elizabeth, you want to give me some cue as to what direction you would like me to go in?
Sure. So I will say I kind of let you because you were doing fantastic in addressing some of the things we had talked about before today. I'll just say too that there's a lot of compliments and in the chat for the information that both Ben has shared and that you are sharing with the group right now. We only have about 3 minutes left, and I wanted to know if you wanted to use that to maybe say a quick pitch for some action that you've been involved in at the legislature, unless there is maybe a different last comment that you'd like to make. I do hear, maybe this is a good one actually, there was just in the chat, is there a way that from the community perspective that there can be more support for community stabilization projects efforts? Maybe that's a good close.
I'm going to say that yes. And I'm going to say by contacting us, we have plenty of work, and financially, from a fiscal perspective, at the state level, at the county level, and we can have assistance in helping with that. I have a big story to tell about that, but also we need to have a climate control. In the state of Minnesota, we do not have a shared heat policy. Each municipality have their own heat policy. And in Minnesota, we should have one single state policy that says anytime the temperature drops below 68 degrees, that's when property owners should have their heating code, heating equipment, but should be supplying heat to their residents, to their renters. And we also need to work with the property owners to make sure that it doesn't become a cost burden to them that gets passed on to the renters as well. So it's a collaboration of a relationship and talking to how we make that happen. And we also just need to make sure that when we talk about energy efficiency, is that the Minnesota Covenants Act. This is, and I can't say a lot about that right now, but if you look at the Minnesota Covenants Act, it has that on livability, that the unit should be energy efficient. We need to amend that to be more specific as well. And again, we should do that through the relationships. But my number is 651-225-8778. CSP has a very wonderful story that we can share. And again, what we do is bring hope into reality through the work that we do. We make it a real living thing every day.
Thank you so much. We have 1 minute left. I will turn it to Ann to close us out. And thank you, Ann. Thank you, Metric.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So again, thank you everyone for participating in our call. In another 2 weeks, on Friday, March 19th, we will have our next call, and we're already lining up some great speakers for that as well. I just want to note, we spoke about the need to invest in housing bonds. And there is a Homes for All action alert I've put in the chat again about this budget setting process and the timing of this. If you have 3 minutes, please use that time to take action, reach out to your legislature and be clear. We need $500 million in housing bonds, 400 for housing infrastructure bonds, and 100 for GO bonds. We can do this, and we need to help address all our housing needs. So thank you so much. We'll see you in 2 weeks.